Welcome to the Frontier Leader Show. Today, Martin is flying solo.
Hello and welcome to the Frontier Leader Show. My name's Martin Wheatley and most weeks I speak to leaders, technologists, change agents in the AI space, learning what good leadership looks like in an AI-shaped world. Today's a bit different. This is a solo podcast and I just wanted to touch on a topic that seems to be prevalent in the media at the minute, which is all around tokens and token cost. But before we get into it, if you could like and subscribe to this podcast, I would very appreciate it. It keeps my mum happy and hopefully you will not miss the next episode. So let's dive into it. So, token costs. There's been a lot of reports recently about people spending a lot of money in the AI industry on tokens and token maxing, a culture of token maxing within a lot of these companies. And I just wanted to dive into what this means for the average person out there and the average team and the average leader when they're considering how to and what to implement within their business. And this is also important now. KPMG published a report in the UK that said around a third of UK business leaders admit they had a limited understanding of how AI costs are actually structured. And more than 4 in 10 say they've only got partial visibility of what their organisation is spending on AI at all. So that's what I just wanted to cover off on today's episode. Now, a lot of people who are paying for monthly subscriptions will not have really seen these token costs much at all. It's a flat fee, £20, $20, whatever, per month that you just use until your usage is used. And then you've got to wait and it resets. In a sense, you don't see the pricing for that, but that is essentially with these resets is what you're seeing with token usage in the background. You just don't see the dollars or the pounds attributed to it. The token costing and this token maxing culture, which started in Silicon Valley, where people were basically on a leaderboard to burn through as much tokens as possible, is all related to API costs, application programming interface costs, which is basically how systems talk to each other. And like I said, most people won't have seen these costs so far. However, what is starting to happen now is that the frontier models, as they are bringing out their new frontier large language models, like Anthropic's Fable 5, they are trying to implement a different way of charging for these models. And it's going to be a hybrid of subscription plus usage. And the usage is at the token rates. OpenAI have said something similar using their Codex application. When you run out of normal credits or tokens within your monthly subscription, you'll then pay on for extra tokens and extra credits. And Microsoft Copilot Cowork have done exactly the same. When they moved that out of their Frontier program into general release, everything on Microsoft Copilot Cowork is on a credit-based and therefore a token-based system. But let's just back up slightly. What is a token? So a token is basically parts of words that an AI model uses to understand what you are asking. It's roughly 1.3 tokens per word, and it's how the AI model understands what you're asking it. The tokens are then split into input and output. So you have the cost of an input token is significantly less than the cost of an output token. And if we look at some of the newer models, so Claude Fable 5, which is the Anthropic model, has $10 per million input tokens and $50 per million output tokens. ChatGPT's equivalent of their frontier model, their Sol models, has 5 per million input and $30 per million output. Makes sense so far. What happens in the middle, though, is called inference, where the model thinks about how it's going to answer you. And anything that happens in the middle is charged at the output pricing. So a question that you ask an AI model could be 200 input tokens, which is negligible on that scale. So the inference and then the output could be as much as 3,000 thinking tokens. So 200 input, 3,000 output. So you can see how this can quickly add up. And, we've got reports of Uber coming out and saying that they blew through their budget for 2026 in 4 months. There is an article, and I don't think it's been fact checked, that somebody left an API process running and cost 500 million over the course of a month, but that's unsubstantiated. But that's the way that the API can cost a business a lot. So you've got your input, your inference, and your output, and they're priced per million. And like I said, the newer models cost a lot more. The cheaper models can go all the way down to like the DeepSeek Chinese models. Could be as little as 14 cents per million input tokens and 28 cents per million output tokens. So there's a vast range in between the cheapest and the most expensive models. Why is this important? Well, for your normal run-of-the-day tasks under your £20 a month subscription, people aren't going to notice. You're going to have to ask a question, you're going to chat with a model backwards and forwards, it's going to produce a Word document, etc., etc. As soon as you move on to this token-based pricing, whether that's on Microsoft or whether it's using Fable 5, things can start adding up very quickly. So, for example, on Microsoft Copilot Cowork, which can take actions on your behalf, which is similar to Anthropic Claude's Cowork, it's built on the same principles. I built an email triage model that ran every morning at 5 a.m. and it basically went through my emails, categorized them, and then archived them, essentially. And then so I knew exactly what I needed to look at for that day based on the category in my inbox. Now, that email triage, before Microsoft changed their billing, was just part of my Copilot subscription. Didn't think about it, didn't see it. However, the first day that Microsoft turned on their charging for this used 317.9 tokens, which is essentially £3.18. Now, you might think that's not a lot of money, and it isn't, I suppose, for a one-off run. But if you scale that up and you say that you run that every day for the month, that comes to roughly £100 per month. But then if you scale that up and you've got a team of 10, that's obviously £1,000 a month. So then all of a sudden, you've now got £12,000 a year additional cost that you didn't have before because of that one little process that took 5 minutes on a morning. Now, that's a very, very small example, but then scale that up even further and just assume that you've got a team of 10 running agents and deep research. The risk is that these can go largely unchecked. Now, there is a paradox in all of this because tokens have got a hell of a lot cheaper from an AI models, from an AI labs perspective. They've got a hell of a lot cheaper. For the same level of capability, the pricing has fallen something like tenfold a year and sometimes even faster. So what cost $60 per million tokens a few years ago costs pennies now. But this is where Jevons paradox comes into it. Now, Jevons paradox first appeared in the time of steam engines, and when the engines got more efficient at using coal, people thought that actually the usage of coal would decrease because the engines wouldn't need as much coal to run. However, the opposite occurred. Because the engines got more efficient, used less coal, we actually ended up using more coal because we could use it at a grander scale. And this is exactly the same principle here. Because the token cost is falling dramatically, the amount of tokens that we are using has actually gone up exponentially. And especially when you then layer on agentic use that burns through a lot more tokens per task, you can quickly see why we are now spending more on tokens, even though the individual token is cheaper. So a drafted email can cost pennies on the dearest model on the market, and nobody really minds about a couple of pennies. But like I said, a serious multi-step agent run can cost more than a month of one person's emails in a single run. So this is where you've got to start thinking about how this could impact your organization as these operations move from pilots into practice. So cheaper units, but we're using vastly more of them, and it's equating to bigger bills. And the labs know that because they've been subsidizing it for all this time, which is why this newer way of charging for it, it has come around. Now, you can see this coming. I mean, all the VC-backed funding that's gone into Anthropic, into OpenAI, they needed to start recouping the costs somehow, and this is how they're deciding to do it at the minute. So how do you get around this? Well, first off, I think there's a big piece on education and making sure that people know what model needs to be used for what task. Don't just set up a scheduled process to run for email triage, for argument's sake, on Fable 5, Anthropic's flagship model at the minute, because that will cost a heck of a lot more than using something like the Sonnet model. In fact, the pricing for the Sonnet model up to the end of August 2026 is $2 per million input and $10 per million output. So a fifth or 20% of what a Fable 5 process would cost. So I think there's a big need for companies to understand that you don't just use the frontier, top tier model for every single task. You need to balance out, and all of the labs come with top tier, middle tier, and a cheap tier. So Anthropic has Fable, Sonnet, and Haiku. OpenAI and their 5.6 now has Sol, Terra, and Luna. And there is a trade-off between intelligence and speed. But sometimes when you've got the process nailed and you know exactly what needs to happen, you don't always need the higher level intelligence. Second thing is you can blend these models to a large extent. So use the frontier models, use the top tier models to make sure that you've got the thinking part of the process done. You've had that orchestrate a decent prompt or a decent skill in the background, and then you can then run it off a cheaper model. You don't need to stick to one or the other. You can flex and say, well, I need the deeper reasoning of a Fable 5, but then actually I can run it day to day in Sonnet or even Haiku, depending on your need and your use case. The second one is when you're setting up anything on a recurring basis, check that you have, because this is where surprise bills can suddenly come from. If things just run on a schedule or a loop and keep spending when anyone's not looking. So, like I said, the automation of emails, the agents that automatically keep trying when something fails and working on loops. And unfortunately, the AI companies don't care whether you've set this up right or not. They just care about the usage of their tokens. So you need to make sure that anything that you're building agentically or that runs without somebody looking at it on a schedule is very closely monitored to make sure that A, as soon as you're not using it, you need to turn it off, but B, it doesn't just get stuck in a loop and run throughout the day trying to figure itself out. So there's that element of it. The other element of it is obviously to set budgets. But how do you set a budget when you don't know how much it's going to cost? Because the other element of tokens is that you can't always see up front what a process is going to cost. So, I mean, my example of the £3 for the email was only found out after I'd run that process once. So this is how you can start budgeting for these activities. If you can build an agent and then you can run it to find out how much it's going to cost, just run it once and get that per time run charge. And then you can figure out what you need to set your budgets, if you need to set any usage caps or anything like that. Now, Microsoft has a very easy way of doing this per user, per team. I think you can do it per team or overall as an organization and set usage caps like that. And I know you can do similar in some of the other Anthropics or OpenAI. But again, you've got to set up these guardrails around processes to make sure that these don't suddenly wake you up in the middle of the night with a cold sweat because you've not remembered to put these on. And then there is a question about whether you use the top tier models or whether and you are working in the cloud and working with them on a SaaS type basis, or whether you flick to the open source models. Now, there's trade-offs and benefits to both. Open source is where you host a model on your infrastructure on a server that you own, and the information doesn't run out and doesn't go to the providers at all. It's all kept in-house. But you've got the development cost of that, you've got the maintenance cost of that, and you've got the whole setup, people to support it. That needs a really well thought through strategic look at where you want to get to, versus what most people will do at the minute, which is obviously use OpenAI, Anthropic, or via Microsoft and use it through, cloud type arrangements with them. But the open source models, once you've got them up and running, basically zero cost per use other than the fixed costs of maintaining that model. So there will be a tipping point in a business where that would become actually probably more viable than using, the models with one of the frontier labs. But that will become more and more of a question, I think, as these AI models develop and as the technology gets easier and easier to run locally. So look, is this all doom and gloom? No, absolutely not. I think a lot can still be done by people where you don't even see an API token or an API cost or a token cost like this. But it is something to keep in mind when starting to scale these operations out from pilots and out across a wider team. Keep an eye on where these processes are running. Otherwise, you could quickly, without knowing it, start accumulating a hefty bill for these kind of activities. And it's all down to how the token cost in and out and the inference in the middle is working. But look, that's a very quick overview of how the token costing works. It's hard to predict until you try it, and then you see what the costs are and what it's actually charged you afterwards. But the more that you use models, the more that you understand how much, it will get easier and easier the more you get used to using the tools ultimately. But that's it for today. Hope that was useful. Hope that explained a few key terms. If you have found this episode useful, then please, whilst you've got your phone in your hand, like and subscribe and share it to someone who might need to understand this in a bit more detail. But for now, thank you very much. Appreciate you listening. Bye-bye for now.